Kaitlin Fleming, Managing Editor of the Alex City Outlook. As part of our special coverage of the city's founding 150 years ago, I'm here with Peggy Walls, author and historian, to walk about downtown Alex City and talk about the history of the city. Okay. So what can you tell me about First Baptist Church?
As far as the Baptist Church was similar to the other churches in its founding. The early churches met up on the hill by what is now Mistletoe Bough. And the first churches met together in buildings, maybe two different denominations, until they built separate buildings.
And that was around 1872, right?
Right.
Right. Okay, so First Baptist started out with a wooden building, of course, right?
Right.
Okay, and then they built a brick building. Now, was it burned in the fire? I think
everything was burned.
Was in this area, right?
Except I have read that it was the first Presbyterian church,
which we'll look at in a minute,
surviving.
So then they built a brick building, and then they put new faces on it and everything. Really, I think maybe the original building is still there underneath. Behind us is the Bud Porch Center, and for those people who are old like me, remember this has been in the post office for a long time.
James Young, the Young family were the founding family to come into this area. His son became the first post office master, Griffin Young, and that from there you have several places that served as the post office before it came over to Bud Porch. And a lot of the reason the post office was moved was simply the need for more space. More people moved in, more mail was coming in. But I would say in a really surprising bit of information to me, I did not know at one time that there was a post office in the Masonic building. And
which is just behind us,
right,
or in front of us.
So let's kind of head that way.
So this building wasn't the first post office then?
No, it was not.
All right, so behind us is the old courthouse for Alex City?
One of the old courthouses. The first one was built in 1888, 89, and it was destroyed in the 1902 fire. And there were a couple of other courthouses between the first and this present one, which I'm sure that many people look at this one as the old courthouse, but it did have different buildings before that.
So right, and the one that was built, I'm sorry, the one that was burned in the fire, was it in this location, or do we know?
This location, maybe some small variants, but
this has kind of always been Court Square,
right? And after the fire, pretty much the town had to be rebuilt.
This building actually served as City Hall for the city for quite some time, until recently, right?
It did.
Behind us is the old First Presbyterian, right?
The First Presbyterian Church was one of the first buildings that was constructed, and some say the only surviving building, but perhaps there were remains that were restored. Cannot say for sure on that matter, but it is noted historically as the remaining building after the 1902 fire. As I said earlier, you can look at Alexander City divided into the pre-fire 1902 and then the post-fire. And there were a lot of things that happened that improved the city after that. First of all, a nice fire department, and they began, all this beautiful brick you see, they began to use brick and rock and more durable construction to protect against fire.
Speaking of a brick building, do you want to pop across the street to look at the Masonic
Yes.
building? Okay, so the Masonic building. What can you tell me about it?
Well, the Masonic building was one of the first of the Masonic buildings accepted into the state. The lodge was named Bradford Lodge after a gentleman here in Alex City in the Bradford community was named after him also.
You mentioned some other things that were in the Masonic building, like the post office, did you say? Was
At one time, and that was one of the places the post office was, I'd say temporarily. And there was a lot of shifting after the fire that were temporary places, and I don't know if that was a part of the changes.
Now, was Graves Furniture attached to it?
Graves Furniture, yes.
Okay.
Preston Graves and his wife Bonnie owned the building. I think 40 years that they were in business.
so let's go down the side here and look down Alabama Street. Okay, so Alabama Street, which, half of it is missing now. It is a park that is named after probably the most prominent thing that was on Alabama Street, which was the Strand Theater.
And it was owned by Mac Jackson, and there were a couple other theaters that were owned by Mac Jackson, the Jackson Theater.
So as far as what was on Alabama Street at the time, there was a restaurant or two, or a cafe or something like.
Across from the Strand, there were a couple of studios. Robert Gray's studio was here, I think, at one time. Sarle's studio, and there was another.
There was a shoe store down there somewhere.
Gillespie.
Okay.
Shoe store.
So at the very bottom, I remember Cherokee Electronics that was owned by the Watley family.
Right.
And then coming up around on the other side was Alex City Tin Shop. Let's see, Miss Jenny's School of Dance, and maybe something else or so in there that I don't remember. But the biggest portion of all this was the Strand Theater. And I mean, when I was growing up, that was the thing to do. That was the place to go. We went every Friday night. Did not matter what was on, unless it was rated R or X. And you say X. Well, Midnight Cowboy, I remember, was rated X. It would be PG at best now, probably. But my biggest memory of the Strand was one of those nights being dropped off. Didn't know what was on, and it was Dr. Zhivago, which is at least a 3-hour movie. And for a 12-year-old, that was the absolute most boring movie I'd ever seen in my life. And I was glad my mom came and picked me up at 9 o'clock, even though it wasn't over. So,
I believe in the old pictures you see the feed and seed store. Here, people walking across the street and the light. You could look that up.
The traffic light was in the middle of the road right here.
And then, there are pictures of that, and it shows the sign Feed and Seed. And it was the Feed and Seed store that the big poster advertising movies like Dr. Zhivago and Gone with the Wind and many other big-time movies.
Where the local is now, there have been some other things, but that was WRFS radio.
Right.
Right.
And the big hit, the person that people always put everything down at lunch and listen to Mrs. Louise Day. She was our star, and if you wanted to hear the news, you did not miss Miss Louise Day.
Yep.
Plus, she puts some interesting twist to it, sort of like the morning shows do now. But you can say the name, and I know I have on my website, and people just come in telling stories about Louise Day like nobody else.
Carlisle Drugstore, most everyone remembers. We were looking at photos the other day, and there was an old Baldies
Right.
that was there. I don't know what kind of
Bar.
bar.
A
Okay.
saloon.
All right, a saloon.
I got more than one picture of old Baldies on my website. Got one where the street looks all like dirt, and it's got people out, and even then there was a railroad track going through the middle of town. Judge C.J. Coley told me one time when I was interviewing him, he said, anywhere you want to go in Alexander City, you have to stop and wait for the train and go over the railroad track. The towns grew up around the railroad track because it brought commerce in and took commerce out.
Now, did we already pass where Radney's furniture
No.
is? Oh, that's this way. Okay. Is it on Calhoun Street? Yes.
It's the tallest building. You see Radney, the tallest building in Alexander City. At one time, the square was an antique shop, and it was called the Queen's Attic, and it burned. And then I think before that there was a high cotton antique shop. If I remember correctly from what I have read, 1902, Benjamin Russell built the first bank in Alexander City, as he did many other first buildings, businesses, so forth. The
Hertzfeld brothers had a bank too, right?
across the street in the Frozen
Okay, was it in that building with the general store?
Yes, Hurstville sold to Frozen. So there was a time it was Hurstville and Frozen, so then it became Frozen's.
Okay, we'll walk over there in a minute. So past the bank was the old Russell Hotel. And,
Piggly Wiggly.
yeah, and I remember when that building was built. I don't remember the Russell Hotel, so I don't know when that was torn down.
In the mid-1950s.
That was before my time. We were talking earlier about it having various names, because I kept seeing Rusco, and I'm like, is that a shortened version of the Russell Hotel, or what? And you mentioned Adams?
Adams at one time.
Because I remember down this street being the Variety Fair. That's one of my childhood memories. My aunt worked there, so we like to go mess up the displays and stuff. While, I'm sure they loved. And then Bywise was down this way. It was another little department store, five and dime kind of thing. My aunt worked there too, so we got to. But see, what was fun about it was the two-story building there, and so I would slip off and go upstairs and get into stuff that I shouldn't. So childhood memories.
Savannah and Memphis Railroad came in 1874, and it transformed Youngsville from a country hamlet to a market town. And this marks the time that Alexander City began to prosper as a small town. You had the old depot was moved to a different place in Alexander City, and the best way to see where it was is to look at old pictures.
So the back of Carlisle's at one point, or behind Carlisle's, was where the train depot was, for a brief period of time, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. If you look at the railroad track, you can kind of go through as to where it was, still in the same place.
Okay.
Some of the pictures, the original one, looked like it was in the middle of the road that we have here now.
It's possible that it was. As I said, you just go back to the old pictures, and you can't always have any kind of signage to really say, okay, it was here or there. You have to look at the old pictures or bits of history. At the end of this strip of stores was the Red Goose shoe store. And that was very popular, and every time you went in and took a child in and they bought a pair of shoes, you get an egg from the Red Goose.
Yeah, I remember. So over here, we had the bank, and then we had King's Furniture that was there for a while.
Right.
And I remember K&W Furniture, but prior to all that was Jackson Theater.
Yes.
And I guess that was the first movie theater in town, because I don't remember it. It was gone.
The first owner of the frozen store was Isaac Frozen, and then the next generation came down, Ralph Frozen and his siblings, and they operated the store for a time. There was a basement. They had basement sales.
Yeah.
People would just line up and they'd go down there and they'd snatch and grab. I mean, truly. And the same was true with the Fair store basement.
Where was the fair store?
Right here, Jake's.
Oh,
At Jake's.
Jake's? Oh, okay.
And there's a wonderful picture on my website where you got cars on here, you got people hanging out windows. I wish I could remember who gave me that picture so I could give them credit, but it's just the best picture ever to show a busy Saturday where people are just, bumping into each other. There's
That was David's Jewelers for a while.
Right.
Too, right.
And then down toward the end is really a nice patch of history. You had the bus stop,
Yeah.
and Mr. Scarborough would ride the bus over to Atlanta and buy shoes, bring them back to Alexander City, and put them in, display them, and sell them. Also, there's a taxi cab service down there. And across the street, I believe you have maybe a service station. Cox.
Kerry Cox.
Yeah,
Right.
there, his ancestors established the car business there, and he told me a wonderful little story they opened about the time the war ended, I think, or before. 1943 or 45, they could only afford one car. So they bought the car and put it in the display window. And a business went on and on to each generation. And of course, that's the building where the muscle cars is.
I had forgotten about the taxi service, Economy Cab. I remember Miss Polly was the driver, and Mr. J.I. So those are, because I rode theirs for a while to school before we braved the school bus, but yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. I had a wonderful time learning about downtown. Where can people read more about downtown? You have a few books, don't you?
I do, thank you. Alexander City book. It's totally about pictures of old Alexander City. Lost Towns in Central Alabama. I have a book that's really popular other places throughout the United States too. It's Alabama Gold, a history of the South's last mother lode. I have a website. It's the Old Alexander City. It's off of Facebook. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.